Hannah Ryder, Ovigwe Eguegu. It's 22nd of June, 2022. Welcome to BRI Dialogues.
Thank you so much for having us.
There's so much in a name, in every organization's name, in an individual's name. Development Reimagined. So that conveys that the development has to be restructured, relooked at. And what is in your name, and what's happening to the development in a rear mirror view, and where do you want it to go?
So I'm going to take this question because as the CEO of Development Reimagined, this was something I thought about very, very carefully about what our name would convey, and I wanted the name of this company to really, this consultancy, to really help people understand exactly what we do and why, but really it's really about our mission, and fundamentally about our mission. Yes, we're a consultancy. There are lots of other consultancies out there, but what's special about us is our mission, that we're focused on trying to reduce poverty. We're focused on trying to increase sustainable development, but we don't want to bring old ideas to that. And we don't think old ideas can really deliver. We're at a point in the world, and when I was kind of creating Development Reimagined, it was a point at which so much was changing and so much is still changing. And we don't want to go back to the past. We want to look forward. And we must learn lessons from the past, look forward to a new type of future, one in which we have reduced poverty globally. So that's really why this name was the right one for us, and why we started it. And of course, since Development Reimagined exists, we have lots of other people talking about reimagining. I have a notification that comes up on Google where reimagined is mentioned, and it's literally every day I get kind of, world reimagined or this reimagined, etc. And it's something which is really catching on. But yes, in the development sector in particular, there's no doubt we must reimagine.
So Hannah, in terms of reimagining, how does the concept of development in itself changed? We here at Durham are engaging in discussions about comparative modernities, that when you get beyond the West, what does modernity really mean? And we're only just scratching the surface of this. But from your vantage point, where you are, if you like, knee deep into these discussions, what does development in the 21st century really mean? And is it geographically determined as well? In other words, does development in sub-Saharan Africa compared with, say, Southeast Asia or South Asia or Latin America mean a different thing? And I'd love to hear both of your views.
Well, I think one of our core values as an organization is that development is about us, not about them over there. And I think quite often in the past, and especially with development organizations, I've worked in development organizations, worked in the UN, etc. There is always a kind of, well, development is something that happens over there, and it's not necessarily our own experience. But the way that we try to think about development is that it affects every single we kind of bring the human side to development. It affects every single person, and that's where we need to, we have to have that kind of human perspective whenever we're thinking about these different solutions to reducing poverty. And it means that, for example, migration is a development policy, trade is a development policy, even kind of student exchanges are a development policy. All of these things affect us. They affect the scope and the possibilities of development. And so I think that's, and you asked about kind of, well, what does that mean for kind of geographies and so on? I think our perspective, and Ovigwe, our perspective is always, kind of, we have a baseline, but we always, kind of change it. We move as we need to. I think our perspective on that would be that, you know, fundamentally, because we're human, all humans have very similar desires and needs, right? But obviously within different geographies, we have access to different resources, we have access to different cultures and ways of being. So of course that will affect some aspects of development, but there are basic needs, you know, and even in the Sustainable Development Goals, I think definitely recognize those even more than the MDGs did, about what that variety of basic needs really are. You know, we need infrastructure, we need education, we need health, etc., etc. And so I think that's those kind of the very basics also do keep us at that right level. But what's great about different geographies is that they can provide different inspiration. And I think that's what is really great about, you know, places like China. I've also lived in Malaysia recently, places like UAE, etc. They provide inspiration to others who are trying to move in different directions. They don't only have to look at what does America look like, or what does Europe look like, what does the UK look like. They can look in very different directions and see that development really is possible within the space of lifetimes.
Let me bring Ovigwe here from a geopolitical point of view. This weaves in very nicely. And I like this fact that development is beyond just, you know, not us and them. It's holistic, universal. It's beyond aid, as you always say it in Development Reimagined, and the diversity. But isn't there, Ovigwe, a momentum in this South-to-South cooperation model at the moment? Isn't the model of inspiration of lifting people out of poverty resonating better when you look at the China's model in the developing world and low and, you know, mid-income countries? What are your optics there, Ovigwe? Is this race already won, or it's still in motion?
Well, yeah, I would like to just even follow up on what Hannah just said with regards to geographies, because one of the most important things for us and how we look at development is we are always very keen on how much of the politics has been missing out from how we look at development and even how we approach development, because it is inherently, you know, development is actually as much a political ambition as it is, you know, even in national ambition, because we understand that there is Congress and there's a nexus between, you know, how much national power you can actually have. You know, you can measure that against your level of development of your economy. So because of the, you know, the similarities within Global South in terms of their experience with colonialism, with imperialism, and all of the structural deficiencies they've been suffering post, you know, independence. Of course, many Global South countries see more commonalities than differences, despite the very, very varying cultural diversity, you know, in the Global South. And then if you contrast that to the industrialized countries, well, yes, there's also the room for and scope for collaboration and even learning, right? But there are very different realities. You know, I mean, a country, for instance, like Scandinavian countries trying to discuss development with, you know, maybe West Africa, it's not the same as to maybe if you have maybe Brazil, for instance, having that conversation with West African countries. It's just very different. So it's in recognizing that difference that you see this enthusiasm towards South-South cooperation, you know, that difference, and the commonalities rather, that you see so much in enthusiasm towards South-South cooperation, and a lot of excitement around, you know, formats like BRICS, you know, because it really gives some form of like togetherness to a common ambition with regards to poverty. Now, why poverty? I believe poverty alleviation that, you know, China, for instance, has really been able to bring more focus towards regards to development is it's not history to us like it is for Northern Europe or America. Like, it's a present reality that you have to deal with, right? And that is why when we're talking about learning from various experiences, like Hannah just mentioned, you really want to learn from those who have addressed the problem and none of us addressed the problem very recently, but did it in a almost in a miraculous way. And they have, the kind of realities that were very similar to yours, right? So very recently I was in a conversation, and in my country here, and someone in the government was very keen to make a difference. Like he said, when did the West really worry about development finance? Like how did they get that development finance? We are not going to go into the specifics of how they got development finance, but I can tell you the way China got development finance, it will be very similar to how African countries will get the development finance. They're going to do it somewhere, whether through your resources or whatever. You're not going to go somewhere else and capture people and force them into indentured labor. You're not going to get that from any of the very strange ways we saw Western countries develop their economies. So you want to learn from those who your future or your the options available to you were the same option that they used, or at least very similar. And that for me, it's these are some of the very small but very crucial nuances that I think need to be brought into the conversation.
I know she's going to jump in, but we have a very fine expression back in Persia. It says, when you have fever, don't go to the doctor. Go to your friend who had fever last week, and he will tell you what you're going to go through. So I leave it up.
Thank you, Ali, for elevating the discussion. Is this right? Absolutely. Your depth of knowledge and experience is shining through your responses to us in both cases, because you're actually preempting the debate that is coming. And Ovigwe, your response zooms in on, I don't know, Hannah, dare I use the term models, but the development models are now changing very dramatically. I want to focus on climate change dimension in a minute. But initially though, what you've both zoomed in on, and what Ovigwe said in terms of the Chinese experience, let's not call it model experience, shows that the neoliberal strategy that international organizations like the IMF and the World Bank and so on have been pursuing since the 1980s, in particular through the Thatcherite and Reaganite developments, is obviously reached, maybe a long time ago, its logical limits. And you're both alluding to awareness of alternative ways of, again, let's not call it development, but poverty alleviation. So in this struggle between the old establishment, if you like, and the Global South awareness of, hang on a minute, there are other ways of doing things. How do Global South agencies navigate these forces?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I also want to emphasize that, some of what we're doing is new, of course, but it also draws on a very, very long experience, long history. And some of what we're trying to do as well is kind of remind everyone that before we had the kind of neoliberal Washington consensus, etc., actually, even in areas like economics, there was so many different schools of economic thoughts, which were kind of all going all together, and people were discussing, well, this is working, that's not working. There was Mao Zedong, there was, all different types. And the idea that we should all just be kind of confined to thinking in just and kind of running our economies in one particular way is highly dangerous, right? We need to have kind of flourishing of different ideas, flourishing of different models. And I think that's, again, the kind of inspiration that countries like China can have. And again, kind of just picking up on a point that Ovigwe is talking, and before we go into other sectors, things like agriculture. China had smallholder farmers. It was a country that was, built on smallholder farmers. And so yet the agriculture sector has transformed. We're talking about food security these days. Understanding how that transformation happened is really crucial. We're talking about health security. Well, look at China and India and their pharmaceutical industries. Those have grown from literally tiny, tiny little industries into flourishing, exporting so much that we need a special footnote in a WTO waiver to recognize that they're exporting so much. they have transformed, and they've transformed the way that geopolitics runs, etc., etc. So I think while of course, you know, we're trying to bring these things anew, we're still trying to reimagine, we also still have to we still need to look at what has been there before.
Very interesting. And to your point, I mean, 40% of China's population still lives in rural population, and 25% of that is still in agriculture, Hannah. That is the combined population of Germany and Italy in agriculture, just to put it into context. But a question for both of you. Isn't there a difference, because the Washington consensus and the model of neoliberalism, as Anush was talking about, has been, you know, let's fix here, let's fix there. This South to South looks at development as a portfolio approach, you know, so it's all together. What are your thoughts about, you know, a strategic credit space that is being provided, and, you know, sitting in Kenya or being in Kenya, Hannah, yourself, the execution of, you know, projects like Nairobi, Mombasa, showing something through the development? You know, what is that element of portfolio approach in your opinion?
Yeah. So Anush was also asking about kind of how development agency, you know, kind of development partners all work together in this area, and I think that also kind of comes to your question as well. You know, with kind of navigating this area, I think one of the things which we're always trying to encourage is much more exchange and collaboration, coordination between different what we would call recipients of development finance, or just generally the global South, I guess, but lower middle income countries. Much more exchange, not only in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of partnerships with development partners. So it's not just a case of we're going to have, you know, let's say if we're talking about, and I was on earlier on today, I was talking on a radio show for Zambia about, you know, their renegotiation and restructuring, debt restructuring, very contemporary, and also affecting things like Belt and Road Initiative. What the understanding, what Zambia is doing has to also be anchored in what other countries, neighboring countries, other African countries are doing, understanding what their experience has been with regards to creditors. There's so much creditor coordination and development partner coordination themselves, but not enough coordination within us, within the global South. Why not? We need to promote that, do much more. And so I think that's also where things like, you know, we're talking about the railway, Kenya, Mombasa, Nairobi railway, which in itself is actually a very, very successful project, and also should be kind of continued across. This is our perspective, at least. You know, we need so many more railways across the African continent. So how can that experience be something that other African countries can use, can learn from, can of course do better? With every single project, there's an opportunity to do better. And again, kind of deepen their own relationships with China through that experience, but also other development partners, and put the right kinds of pressure on other development partners to do better. I mean, look, World Bank hasn't financed a rail project, a kind of individual new rail project on the African continent since 2000. Gosh. Right? So China's filling a serious gap, and those gaps are very real gaps, and it's important for all development partners to understand them, but they've quite often, until now at least, been ignored.
So if you're standing on a platform for financing, you have to wait for 22 years for the train of World Bank to arrive, whereas the bullet train of China arrives.
Yeah, and the fact is that, you know, things like rail projects are public goods, and they're not. It's going to be very difficult to kind of have a return, which is going to substitute for the entire project. Which is why that Kenya Mombasa project. What, you don't think the government tried to do PPPs with that project for years and years? Constantly, you know, growing up in Kenya, we would hear, oh yes, the South Africans are coming. They're going to be rehabilitating this rail. Turks are coming. They're going to be Turkish government is coming. They're going to be. Those PPP models just didn't work for it, and kind of. So it is a serious gap, and if you don't have international financial institutions kind of engaging in that area, then of course it leaves space for the global south to also work together to do that. And I think it's just right that it does.
So I've got two questions for you both. The first one is, I had written down not transferable skills, but transferable experiences, which is exactly what you've zoomed in on, Hannah, here, very, very articulately as well. But in practice, how do African countries transfer those experiences when the borders remain hard borders and uncertainty and insecurity continues to permeate in the continent? First. And the second question, where you're sitting, Ovigwe, how do populations respond to the material changes in their lives? And does that perception then lead up into the policy-making circles?
So let me take the question first, and then Ovigwe, you come in. So I think, again, since we've talked about it, we've mentioned the word inspiration. I think we can be inspired by some recent experience. In particular, in COVID-19, the role of the Africa CDC was very, very crucial. So what we have with the Africa CDC is Africa CDC kind of quickly got to grips with tracking what was happening on COVID-19 on the continent, coordinated health ministers, coordinated health heads of state as well, to kind of think through, well, what are the COVID-19 management strategies that the continent can use? And not only drawing experience from, and avoiding kind of being just going into the trap of just looking at what America or the UK or Europe were doing. They looked literally across the world, looked at what China was doing, looked at what other Asian countries are doing. So it meant, for example, that African countries were amongst the first to be kind of having mask policies outside of Asia, to say, we're going to be so these sorts of things were really, really helpful. And I think that provides a really great basis for further coordination in lots of different areas. Look at in economic areas, whether it's, we've got the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is, government commitment, and we've got the AFCFTA Secretariat in Accra. That is an opportunity for coordination on trade policy, on investment policy, on competition policy, on all these sorts of areas. And I think we can use that inspiration to do a lot more, and therefore avoid these sort of the issues around hard borders. We're all connected, and I think that strengthening within the African region can be very useful.
Ovigwe, would you like to add to that, or?
Yeah, so for the second question, I think it even connects to all you've been saying about neoliberalism and all of material benefits and how people actually interpret that. I always like to use an example of my own personal experience to answer questions like that. Not very long ago, I was in Kano State, so one of the states where you have the Chinese finance railway in Nigeria actually going through, and the reason for being there was around the time we had issue of debt, in 2020 with COVID-19 and a lot of concern. So there was a lot of work at the community level to understand, particularly communities where this railway was going to pass through, right? And while in the community, while we're doing like community interfacing with the members of the community, one of the men stood up and asked a question. He said that there's so much concern about debt and how much Nigeria owes into foreign country, but he is already benefited from this particular railway. But he wants to ask a question. As a farmer, he asked the question. He said that he knows Nigeria owes money to the World Bank, to the IMF and all of these organizations, and owes money to China as well. But that he's 46 years old, he can't go outside of his house now to point exactly what Nigeria has done with the financing it got from the IMF and the World Bank. But look at the railway in front of me with the money Nigeria got from the government of China. That is something very tangible. and also because not just tangible that the people can see, and that is already influencing how they judge the policies of the government, but it also impacts, it also speaks to the needs of the people. Because just like Hannah was mentioning with the SGR, the railway projects in Nigeria and even other projects that are still awaiting finance, like the Mambila hydropower project, these have been decades in the making. I mean, the Mambila, for instance, goes all the way back to the late 70s. You know, just think about that. One hydropower plant since, I don't know how old any of us, everyone here is, but just think about how long it takes to try to build one hydropower plant just because you can't get, you know, financing for it. And compare the population Nigeria had in the 70s, 80s to the population we have now. You know, to see how, that's why we have a situation where, as I'm in this meeting with you, with everyone here now, I don't even have power, right? So these are the kind of deficits that have been accumulating year in, year out, just because, you know, there is a disconnect between what the reality on the ground really is and what whatever model that these multilateral development banks have been using. So the disconnect, I would always say, is because they don't have the same realities as these countries that they are facing today. You could just look at how easily they switched, you know, on the energy issue. Gas was not green, nuclear was not green, until gas became almost strategic, you know, to the very survival of the economies, and all of a sudden it became green. You know, it goes back. That is, if you don't have the same realities as these countries are trying to develop, you have to do more of the listening as opposed to the lecturing. And that is really another critical difference when it comes to South-South cooperation. It's not just the commonalities, but also the fact that there is a sense of humility to listen to what the material benefits and priorities are for the citizens. And that has shown to be very, very effective when it comes to, you know, South-South cooperation on development.
You're a man of geopolitics, and Hannah, the lady of development. This is a very nice dialogue to have here today. But thank you to both of you. I mean, when you look at, I was looking at some data from Aid Data, a research lab from William and Mary College, and you know, and the 2021 report, credit to them. They say 20 years of investment, 165 countries, 13,427 projects, $843 billion of investment of China's international development finance. And back to your point, Ovigwe, when you look at the budget in Iraq and Afghanistan, $2.43 trillion and $2.3 trillion, $4.7 trillion, very little to show. Is the geopolitical weight as well tilting through your lens, Ovigwe, in moving forward? So there's a lot of criticism of debt trap and, the projects that have fallen through. And then yet, you know, when you look at the stats, that number is around 3% of the BRI projects that really have been, you know, questionable. That's still a very good score, as you were saying, isn't it? 97%, something to show, a train to catch. How will this change the destination of geopolitical voting rights in UN through your lens in 5 years, in 10 years from now?
Oh yeah, it's going to be very, very interesting to watch. Let me give you an example of what's happening. Right now, we're looking at the expansion of BRICS to include many other emerging economies in the world. And the very populous ones of Nigeria, for instance, Indonesia, these are already being discussed. As of today, over 60% of the world's population is east of Istanbul, right? And then the two biggest economy today is the US, but the second is China, and very quickly the third is very likely to be India, right? So when you look at the dynamics, and we always hear even from Western scholars about the Asian century, right? I would say it's not just the Asian century; it's going to be the global South century, because it's not. If you then look at Africa's population, for instance, you know, by mid-century will be 2.4 billion people. If we get many of the critical infrastructure right, the catalyzing of African economic growth and what that will do to their, you know, political power and ability to shape global policy will be very significant. So it's not just the rise of the economies or the population, it's also the perspectives as well that will become easily more dominant, because presently, the concentration of capital in London, Frankfurt, and in New York, of course, gives a lot of influence over global policy. But as that shifts, of course, we're going to see, many countries, in the global south, as said themselves, because like Hannah earlier mentioned, you have the G7, for instance. G7 countries, significant economies, very influential, and they are so well coordinated, right? So if the most influential people are coordinated, why shouldn't the very, very weak and not so developed countries be coordinating? And that's one of the very important, role you see BRICS is going to play. We're already seeing so many people liking it to be like the alternative, to the G7, because of how the grouping, is emerging, and it's very different approaches to, structural economics. So I think from that perspective, there will be a lot of shifts geopolitically, and that would mean many countries that are trying to assert themselves and keep their hegemony will come up with all sorts of ways to, trying to prevent that shift. And one of them is actually the debt trap, diplomacy. Let me give a good example: Nigeria. Again, going back to 2020, when we started hearing, about, COVID-19 and debt default, there was so much hysteria. We did very fantastic work. Just about that time, we're doing, our deep dives into, an analysis of each of our African countries, looking at what the debt profiles are. Very fantastic document that we did. Nigeria, for instance, we saw so much hysteria in Western press, and even our domestic, press, on indebtedness to China. Our government was in a position where it had to actually say, okay, you know what, let us go into the books and then look at what exactly the figures say. Right. The debt management office prepared, very nice infographic and presented it. Nigeria's public debt to China was about 4%. Just 4%. That immediately destroyed. In fact, the hysteria went from this to like this, right? Because all of a sudden, people looked at the numbers and like, wait, of all the money we owe to all of the governments and all of the financing partners in the world, China just 4%. And then if you compare that, look at the 4% and look at all of the things you can actually see with your physical eye that 4% has produced, there was almost no argument anymore, right? So you couldn't, even till date, you don't even hear any of those talk about debt trap and debt diplomacy in our national discourse. And I say that is true for many cases. If you really go down to the numbers, you find out that it's mostly hot air and not the reality at all. So that is why I think we have to be able to separate truths from facts and not narratives.
Yeah, and that's definitely something. Please comment. Yeah, it's definitely something which we really try to bring. We're very much kind of, here is the data, here is the information. Let people look at it carefully and have it all in front of them. I also think, coming back to Ali's question in terms of sort of shifts in institutions, I think one of the biggest challenges is how quickly can these institutions actually reimagine, right? So if we're talking about the UN, Ovigwe and I have written a piece also with our other colleague, Anna, about the reform of the UN Security Council, going beyond the very sort of typical, let's just expand the Security Council to an actual reimagining of like, how could we create a Security Council from scratch? What would we do if we did? And having and thinking about permanency in a completely different way. But there's similar kinds of reimagining that really needs to happen with regards to IMF, with regards to World Bank. And I think, at the very least, doing things, the very simple shifts, like having better representation across staff, and kind of encouraging a more kind of multiplicity of thinking and all this sort of thing, is the very least that can be done in order to get a little bit ahead of that. And I think one of my greatest concerns is that you know, there's so much sort of assertion of the way that we're doing things is right, you know, from the G7, you know, kind of almost going back to kind of where we were at the beginning of, you were talking about it, Anuj, at the beginning of the 1980s, of like, okay, there's a famine in Ethiopia, and there's this, and these bad things are happening. Let's just have the same model that we had, which is, you know, let's have debt relief, let's have all of kind of, and that's not the answer today. We are in a very, very different place today. And I just worry that so many of the institutions, especially in Europe, etc., are just so stuck. And think that it's just a case of like, okay, well, yeah, let's just announce some more financing pledges. It's not good enough. It needs to transform into something real. And it just, and what the other countries like China have shown is that it can be transformed into something real. And yeah, they have to kind of start changing.
Yeah, I think the message is very loud and very, very clear, crystal clear indeed, Hannah. Thank you both. So I've got 3 questions, but I know Ali's not going to let me put the third one in, so I'll hang on to the third one. But I'm just kind of putting it on the shelf. The 2 that I want to raise with you both. The first is I'm intrigued that neither of you have mentioned the G20. Ovigwe, you focused on the BRICS, and you've pressed very hard on the veracity of it, which is, I understand. But given the agenda, Hannah, you're pursuing in terms of inclusivity, I was struck that neither of you talked about the G20 as a way of, if you like, diluting the G7, but also building back better. Somebody else has said that already, so I can't copyright it. So I'll be interested in your response to that one, why you're not pressing that button. And the second is, Hannah, you've put very clearly that we are in a different place compared to all of the last century and much of this century. And we are very conscious now of the environmental dimensions of development, however you imagine it. Given COP26, and given that every target is going to be missed thanks to the war against Ukraine, how is that kind of unexpected transition to a worse place going to be affecting your own thinking, but also the calculations of the parties with which you work? I'll hang on to my third question, as I said.
Excellent. Okay, how about I'll start with G20, and I think, and I don't know whether Ovigwe and I whether we have the same view on this one, but I do think G20 is very important, actually. I have done quite a lot in the past, also in terms of kind of briefing on things like G20 and so on, and I do think it is a very important forum. And in fact, more recently, have been kind of arguing that the G20 should be extended to incorporate the African region, to have the African Union and the chair of the African Union also kind of represented in the structure, just like the European Union is. Just because, look, Africa is in total as a continent the 8th largest world economy. So why is it not even in there? But I think, kind of similarly to the other institutions, I think this is an inflection point also for the G20. So this point is an inflection point, not only, and you know, it will be presented as if it's an inflection point with regards to Russia, of course, but I think it is an inflection point with regards to whether the G20 itself can kind of move out of kind of, in many ways, semi G7 dominance, because it has been kind of organized in that kind of shape, and but if it can incorporate more members, etc. So I do think if let's say the African region can be represented, that would make a significant difference to it going forwards, and could actually make it quite useful. And I think it has been useful, like I said, and picked on topics like infrastructure and so on. I think have been quite helpful for coordination. But yeah, just leaving out Africa, which is just not good enough. And then with regards to climate change, maybe, but Ovigwe, why don't you talk about G20 and BRICS? What do you think of the kind of key points? And then we can talk about climate.
Yeah. So first of all, this is how I imagine development, where you can be in the same organization, but we have very different perspectives on certain issues. That is the diversity we're talking about. But with regards to G20, unlike Hannah, I'm not very enthusiastic about the G20. And that is because it's not as if as a grouping, it can't solve problems, but we have to look at the geopolitical realities. The great power competition we have now has effectively destroyed, or at least to a large extent, degraded the effectiveness of multilateralism, right? And the G20 is only functions because you can have compromise between all of the 20 major economies. Right now, with G7, there's no China, there's no Russia, so very easy for them to form a consensus. But we go to the G20, you're expanding, including China, Russia, India. You are in a very different landscape when those negotiations really start to unfold. So I think because of the global political climate, the G20, in my opinion, is not going to be very effective. Just look at the DSSI, for instance. How much was that really the best that we could have done? When the debt issue came up after COVID, of course not. So, and even till date, people, several parts of the world, they're still struggling to deal, with the even ideas and suggestions on how to improve the DSSI, and it all goes back to nobody wants to make compromise, to make the other side seem like the winner. So we can't have to face reality. So if you cannot work within the G20, then it is in the interest of the less developed or the developing and the weakest to actually go on to creating an alternative system that suits their reality. And that's why, for me, the BRICS, an expanded BRICS, you will find will be even more effective than the G20 if we get to that group, get our grouping to be very inclusive with the major economies.
But this is where I differ. So Ovigwe, DSSI was not agreed by G7. It wasn't agreed by BRICS, but G20 did. So what it is also, but I mean, I completely agree with your point, but it's also where there was ability to, you could have a country like China saying, yeah, we can do DSSI, and yeah, we're going to be the biggest contributor, but we can do it, then everyone else can. And you can't kind of have that I don't know. I think there's still a role for it. Definitely BRICS expanded, definitely, keep going with G7, etc., allies, all of that stuff. But I think there's still room for G20, G21.
Yeah. It's going to be interesting, like we have the World Cup for soccer and everybody's blood gets, pumping and everything. Why not having G7 and G13 competing on SDGs for every year, and independent audit, and, show me the project, show me the impact, show me the money. But talking about that, Africa
hang on, Ali. Sorry, Ali. I think this is a really important point to just stress for a second before your response to climate change, because Ovigwe, I'm also leaning towards Hannah's position for two reasons, and let's see what you got back in your bag in response. One is that in many ways the G20 is a way of bringing the G7 on board with these emerging economies. My concern, though, in terms of how you articulate geopolitics, is creating another grouping which is dangerously appearing hostile to the others, and that polarization that might occur could actually cost development agendas much more than Hannah's term of inclusivity, of actually bringing countries, powerful countries like China, like Saudi Arabia, like India, to bring pressure to bear on the G7 within the G20 for doing things differently, right?
No, this is what I would argue is the G7 allows these countries, the developed countries, to actually coordinate very closely and have a common position, which they bring to the G20. The remaining 13 members of the G20 do not have an equivalent of the G7 where they actually coordinate their own global south perspective to bring to the G20. That is my first point. Second point, even if we're going to have a G20, and I agree, I support it, it's supposed to be like where the world would meet, right? But let us each respectively have our own platform for coordination. Second, the G20, the BRICS Plus, I do not think it's actually built to be hostile. It's actually a reaction due to decades of frustration and the different perspective on how development should. If the BRICS Plus is actually hostile, India wouldn't be a member, because India is in every of this current security architecture that the West is trying to use to contain China, Quad member. It attends, all of the major, summits where all of security positions and strategic planning is engaged. India even has its own national problems with China, the Gawan and border issues. So if India, given its differences with China, is able to see the importance of BRICS, it tells you because of it recognizes that as an emerging country, it needs to learn, it needs to coordinate and cooperate with like-minded countries when it comes to structural issues. So my argument for BRICS Plus is that, one, it gives that counterbalance to G7, and then we can all bring our positions to negotiate in the G20.
There we go. That's why we have Ovigwe on in Development Reimagined.
And on climate change, I just want to nudge another question. Africa needs around $25 billion a year for electricity and power generation, and between 2019 and 2021, apparently it's been an erosion of around 4% in development of capacity, and still 43% of Africa's population, back to the points that Ovigwe was touching on, don't have access to electricity. Is the multilateralization of finance through BRI, Ovigwe, back to your point, and Hannah, to you, through the development lens, gonna be more rapid within the global South, or going back again and telling, let's create a cocktail of build back a better world and BRI, and and then I don't want it steered, I want it shaken, So how quickly can we get to delivery? Yeah. How isn't there this multilateralization can happen faster at the global South level?
Do you want to take that one, Ovigwe, first?
Okay. Well, I would say, if you're an African country, you want to maybe build a railway or build an airport or a harbor, you're better off looking at the world and say, okay, what are my options? So there's Better Road Initiative, China, and that collaboration. That is one. Of course, if we have a proper response from Western countries like the B3W and Global Gateway, that gives you even more, options. Aside in many of the other options that we in Development Reimagined have developed to say, okay, these are ways we could actually build infrastructure, like even looking at, things like reform SDR and reallocation and all of that, right? So I think, in a way, the competition and whether it's for climate or infrastructure, benefits developing countries, particularly African countries, because it gives them options, and options never really hurts anybody, insofar as you understand the intricacies of each of the various options, and if you can actually handle, the not so easy parts, right? So I think that is one. Now, with regards to energy and climate, I would say it's not as if African countries, because very, very so often, particularly my country, Nigeria, and our current vice president has been very, very firm on what the transition for African countries should be like. We should be given a different timetable because we're really behind in terms of industrialization, and we need energy for the industrialization. And one of the points we always make is this: you cannot expect the least developed countries in the world that don't have the technological capacity, that don't have the financing, to be the ones to industrialize using renewables, right? Which we know that in terms of the cost per kilowatt, it's not there yet. It's not comparable to maybe coal. Okay, nobody wants to use coal, but at least gas, right? So even when Europe chose to say gas is going to be its transition fuel, that for us was a welcome development. We're going to do it either way, but it gives us, that understanding that at least you now recognize that this is very crucial, right? So for us, I think with climate going forward, it's not as if African countries, it's not an argument for equal opportunity to vandalize the planet. That's not why we're arguing for gas, right? It's because the economics just doesn't check out, for us right now. And we really need to develop big. I mean, you just think about what I had work to do, but I didn't do the work on my laptop. I had an article to write. I couldn't write the article on my laptop because I was saving battery for this meeting. Right. You can see how unproductive or how that can be very starting to productivity. And I'm just one person. Scale that into the entire population and you see what you have. Yeah. And if we cannot build it, to finish my point, if you cannot build the hydropower or any of these gas power projects, what do people do? They use diesel. They use diesel generators, which is worse because now you have noise pollution, you have increased demand for diesel, which is also a fossil fuel, and then you have the air pollution, as well. So it just really complicates the entire process. It is cheaper and better for the environment if we're able to really find ways to build, and scale either of the renewables or whatever, but at least base load should be very secure. And I think, the African countries are very clear on how they want to do that. And it's right now, I think gas is still, the best bet.
Yeah, and just to sort of build on that, I think one of the things we're aware of, and I worked on the Stern Review of the Economics of Climate Change, which was kind of, in 2006, saying, okay, this is not just a scientific issue, this is an economic issue, and we need to take the economic issue seriously. We need to be. I think the big challenge is that just not enough has been done so far by the tools that we have, with the tools that we have. And even, again, back at that time, I was writing about how, the focus on fossil fuel investment has not really been particularly helpful for African countries in any case, because, people still haven't got the same access to electricity, still hasn't gone up since the 1970s, really. But I think it's also about our framing. And I liked what Ovigwe was saying with regards to industrialization, because again, I think what we have to be really clear about is, and again, when we're kind of speaking to Chinese stakeholders about investment opportunities and so on in the energy area or in the renewables area and so on, what we're really keen to say is, look, the African continent ambition is to be the third largest world economy globally by 2063. That's where we're trying to head for. And what we're also trying to head for is to be, instead of China being the world's manufacturing hub, we want to be the world's manufacturing hub. Now, how are we going to get there if you're doing piecemeal things, which are kind of, this hydro station here, this, and it takes, 10 years or whatever to negotiate. You still don't do it after 20. We cannot have that kind of approach. And what really concerns me is that, even we've got all these lovely initiatives, Build Back Better, et cetera, and even the whole climate finance arena, we can't take the approach of this is just, we're going to let the private sector governments are going to let the private sector go and find these projects and then ask for a little bit of subsidy, etc. It's just not going to work. It needs to be something a lot more intentional, a lot more government driven, kind of like what China has done with the BRI, something much more and I think the word is right, intentional.
Right.
And so I think that's how we can overcome this. And I think that intentionality can include gas, at least as a transition. But fundamentally also, the African continent does have some extremely large renewable resources available. Yeah. And eventually those things will become cost effective. They will become the answer. And that will be what's powering our manufacturing. We don't want to have China level of pollution. I lived in Beijing, right. And it's much better now. But I lived in Beijing during those high pollution times, and it was really difficult. Raising a family in those environments is not good. Right. But so I think we definitely want to avoid that. We want to leapfrog that, but our ambition is too high to be able to say no to some transition fuels.
Profound, both of you. leapfrogging is obviously, they're very concerned. Of course, many of the technologies that would facilitate Africa's rapid development are now embedded in Chinese development. So it goes well beyond BRI's infrastructure for transport. It's BRI as infrastructure for tooling up for this new model of industrialization, if you will. I've got another 25 questions, but you'll be glad to know I'm only going to ask one. And this one, again, I'm very interested in the responses that you may give. And it's in the realm of geopolitics and geoeconomics, right? And it's in two parts. So Ali, technically it's only one question, right? It's this. There is now a climate of polarization, and there is now this drive to contain China. I think it's fool's gold. It's not going to happen for many of the reasons that you yourselves have focused on. But nevertheless, this mindset leads to strategy, and that strategy has implications for the rest of the world. The two-part question is, how do the countries of the Global South think about mitigating this rising tension? The second part of it is, how might it impact China's interaction with the Global South if it has to put more resources behind its hard power?
Big questions. I think we've seen a really good example of it through the voting with Russia, Ukraine. I think that provides a really sort of profound reflection in which, in the sense of, I think many African countries, especially, and I mean, and we do most of our analysis on African countries. We do quite a lot of work on kind of environment and climate change in Asia Pacific, but most of our work is really focused on African countries, and especially when it comes to sort of geopolitics, etc. I think the position that many countries have taken is one of kind of national interest plus principles, and principles kind of going back, and another kind of phrase, grouping that we haven't talked about is non-aligned movement. Kind of going back to what are those principles which are really kind of fundamental to that, plus our own national interest. And it's that combination, I think, that also would and does drive certainly African countries' engagement with China, and in terms of how as well as others. And so I think that gives a good indication of how that could continue. And it just, I mean, generally when we speak to others, or we're in forums in which, the framing is, well, we're countering China, or except, it's sort of, well, yes, but you really need to think about what we need as Africans. It's not, that needs to be the starting point rather than countering. And it feels rather unfortunate, because again, it just won't lead to the right solutions if that agency isn't taken into account. But let me ask Ovigwe to go with your, perhaps the second question, and if there's anything else that you want to add.
Yeah. So I think how should we respond to great power competition? Even in the AU, for instance, if you look, I think it was Malabo, no, it wasn't in Malabo. We have a clear position on being pro multipolarity, right? That is the AU's perspective on how the world should be. Unipolarity, it's not as if we're against unipolarity. We are assertive towards multipolarity, because we understand that from out of many will come even more opportunities for the continent. And the BRI, just an example, we had infrastructure deficit for decades in this continent. Before the BRI came along, nobody came out with a global gateway or B3W. It only came after we saw China propose BRI, and after the BRI has shown to be very effective, right? So because knowing the benefit of having a world where there are different power centers and what that means for African options with regards to development, security, economics, whatever, is why you see that the content is very clear there's strong preference towards a multipolar world order. Now, secondly, the question you mentioned about what that strategy would have impact for the global South. I mean, the question I've always asked is, China is not a threat to us. I mean, we're not a world power. We're not in charge. We're not in charge of anything.
Not yet.
Exactly. Not yet.
2063.
So until then, we don't have a problem whether the Chinese Navy is launching an aircraft carrier every 2 weeks. That's America's problem. So and I think that's why the Indian foreign minister was very clear in regards to the Russia issue. You cannot make your problem our problem, right? It's not a problem for African countries if the Chinese economy, eclipses the US economy. It's not, whether militarily or economically. If anything, it's actually going to benefit us, because given the trade relations now, that market and your potential for African brands is massive, right? So these are actually the issues we're looking at. So from a strategic perspective, there's no threat, as Hannah said, not yet. And then from the development perspective and economic perspective, the more we have this diversification and opening up of the global economic power structures, the better it is for African countries.
And coming back to the point about reimagining, it creates the space for imagination of multipolarity that also has Africa as a global power, right?
Yeah.
So not a country, but a global power. So it's just, I think it is also part of that too. And I think we have to remember that can also be a possibility.
Listen, normally on BRI Dialogues, we have one guest, but today, as the African proverb goes, that, if you want to travel fast, travel alone. If you want to travel far, travel together. So with both of you, we've covered so much, and we're so grateful to have you. And thank you so much. I normally bring our sessions to an end. And given your both insights into BRI, I'm going to ask 2 questions. This is my first time asking 2 questions on this session, just for the record. But somebody knows what I'm talking about, but that's fine. But so here are 2 questions, one for you and one for Ovigwe Hannah. Your advice to the xenophobes, if you were to give them one single advice, this is for Ovigwe. Your advice to cinephiles, Hannah, if you were to give them one piece of advice from where you guys are sitting.
Is Ovigwe going first?
He's thinking.
Yeah. No. I have to defer to my boss. So, with regards to xenophobes, I would say you need to have an open mind, because I think most of the reaction or the anxiety towards China is because most people in the countries where you have this xenophobia really do not really understand China, and many times have not paid attention to actually studying what China is, its history, its culture, and how it's different, strategic culture, whatever. People need to learn, and that would be my big advice to xenophobes. Because if you fear what you don't understand, right? So to reduce the anxiety, learn and have an open mind.
And I think in many ways, my answer is going to be quite similar, because I think one of the gaps that we see in Development Reimagined, in which we try and fill, is trying to actually go into a bit more depth about, for example, the Chinese experience on pharmaceutical growth, or Chinese experience on agriculture, etc. Because there is just this sort of, China's this big economy and therefore it's just there. But I think even those people who are interested in China, I think we need to go in a lot more depth. We need to understand a lot more, and so that actually what we're talking about is a lot more credible, a lot more understood, and does not kind of go to the degree of sort of too much excitement. And we need to understand the pros and cons of different models, but just treat China with impartiality and objectivity. I think it's very important. and just sort of, because I'm going to take my prerogative to also kind of build on the question about Sino, on those who are not interested in China. I think one way of also getting around that is also just to focus on, let's say, if you're talking about China, Africa, focus on African countries and what they need. So if you don't want to talk about China, don't. But then actually don't speak about China. Yeah. Don't then have your strategy as a countering China strategy. That's just not helpful.
Yeah, yeah, brilliant. I have I can't say the pleasure, because I don't want to let you go, of thanking you for having joined us. I have to say, you two have shown up Ali and I's double act, and I do not want this to become a precedent for future guests to bring in another one with them, because I don't think Ali and I can keep up with the depth of engagement that you've both shown us in our dialogue today. You've both been extraordinary, Ovigwe and Hannah, and we really appreciate your frank engagement with us. And between the four of us, I've really enjoyed the quartet because it actually allowed us to flow conversations freely across, and your exchanges have been as valuable as anything that you would have told us unilaterally. So it's really much appreciated. The world that you paint is a promising world. And Ovigwe, you alluded to age. No matter what, I intend to be there to see this new world that you're reimagining, because I think it's going to be a much better world than we have. While you identify the potholes and the challenges, what is remarkable is in both of you, there is this incredible constructive energy to move forward and not see a world changing as an obstacle, as an opportunity. So the message that I'm taking is precisely that we are into a braver new world, and that, you know, the modernities of this century and beyond are going to be written by countries that we today call the global south, but tomorrow we'll be calling the established economies, the world powers, if you will, Hannah, that you're aspiring towards. So Kanali and I thank you both very warmly for the time you've given us, but also for the extraordinary insights that you've given us. And you never know, we might come back for another round of double tennis with you shortly.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for having us. It was really a pleasure. And for being willing to have both of us on the show too. It's great. Really.
Thank you both. Thank you.
Great questions as well, even if they come in pairs or even three.